They say the forest hides monsters, but Alira knew better. Once, long ago, she saved one, and tonight, beneath the burning trees, he would return to claim her. The train let Alira off at a platform that wasn't much more than a concrete lip and a sun-faded bench. The forest rose past the station like a wall, hemlock and spruce and old oak, the kind of green that looked almost black when clouds moved over the sun. There was the faint sweetness of sap in the air and a deeper smell beneath it, damp earth and leaf rot, like the ground was breathing. She hitch-strapped her pack and started down the cracked lane toward town. The lane hadn't changed. Tire ruts hardened into fossils, wind belt of weeds nodding with burrs, the ditch still black with water that never quite drained. Her boot scraped a rusted bottle cap. It spun a small arc and disappeared into cattails. The old pendant at her neck, a leaf carved from local stone, tapped once against her collarbone, smooth from years of wear. She had found it at 12 years old, left on the path where she freed him. She never told anyone where it came from, but she knew whose hands had carved it. A man in a feed store cap stood outside the gas station, half hunched under the eave with a cigarette and a coffee in a paper cup. He watched her like people watch storms, the kind where you don't know if it'll pass or turn. "You're back," he said, like it might be a mistake. "Just visiting," Alira said. She kept moving. In windows, curtains shifted and settled. Wind chimes made from bent forks and blue glass knocked together, soft and random. Someone had staked a hand-painted sign in the hardware store's front lot. "Community meeting tonight. Protect our livestock." Below it, in smaller letters, "No more monsters." Monsters. The words stuck like a burr. She walked on until pavement gave way to cracked macadam, and macadam to gravel, and gravel to packed dirt, where the town gave up and the woods began. On the boundary was the same battered county sign she remembered, "Dial 555 for wildlife issues," riddled with BB marks, and a single shotgun blast that had punched out the word wild. Years ago she had stood on this same spot, fingers clenched, heart too big in her chest, knowing something in the green beyond was suffering and no one would help. She did not think about that day. She only noticed how her breath deepened as the shade folded over her and the first cedar needles crunched under her boot. Sound changed in the trees, dampened, and then amplified in strange directions. A squirrel's skitter became thunder on bark, a jay's cry sliced like metal. From the right, the underbrush shivered. Alira paused, not afraid exactly, but alert in the way you get when the forest sets its attention on you. "Hello?" she said to nothing, to everything. It came out quieter than she meant, more reverent. She reached the old river path without choosing it, her feet finding the shape of the land, the way hands remember a friend's face. The river ran tannin brown and quick between moss-slick stones, talking in a constant, secretive voice. In a white alder's roots, a web of snagged fishing line tangled like frost. She knelt and worked it free, careful, the way you learn to be when something soft can break. A wind threaded through the crowns, cool for late summer, smelling faintly of smoke. She turned, frowning. Too early for burn piles, too sharp a scent. Downstream, a dog barked once, then twice, frustrated. Alira straightened. The dog bark had a direction to it, and beyond that bark, the woods held something like holding its breath, waiting. "Alira?" The voice came from behind her, and she turned to find Mara Greeley, who had run the diner grill since before Alira was tall enough to see over the counter. Mara still wore her hair in a kerchief and flour on her jeans. "Mara." Alira felt her face open into a real smile for the first time since the train. "You look the same." "Liar, I look like biscuits in years. You look like you went and got yourself a life." Mara studied her. "Your aunt said you might be coming? You staying with her up Mill Road?" "For now." Alira hesitated then. "What's the meeting about?" Mara's mouth flattened. "Got calves taken last week. Wilkes boy swears he saw something big at the tree line night after, stood up like a man." Her eyes flicked past Alira into the trees, as if the forest could be listening for its own name. Folks get riled. Hunters from over the ridge sniff around. Bad mix. "Is anyone checking the fences? Checking for dogs?" Alira asked. Mara gave her a look that said, "You're sweet, and you don't know how it gets all at once. You mind yourself. Sometimes the woods mind you back, and not in a kind way." She touched Alira's shoulder, brief and warm, and headed back along the path, leaving flower fingerprints on the air. Alira stood a moment longer, watching the place where Mara had been. The woods behind that place watched back. It was a sensation she remembered from childhood, the sense of being regarded, weighed, and, most unsettling of all, recognized. Her pendant tapped her collarbone again as she drew a breath and stepped off the path. The dog barked a third time, farther now. She kept her footfalls deliberate, parting ferns instead of trampling them, using her palm against a fir trunk to steady herself over a slick patch of duff. The bark cut off abruptly. Silence pooled. She found the dog in a small seep hollow, one paw caught in the loop of a wire snare. The line had tightened around the wet fur and into skin that wept bright blood. The dog's eyes were wide and white-rimmed. He bared his teeth but didn't growl. Fear, not anger. "Hey," Alira murmured. She crouched, keeping her hands where he could see them. "Okay, I see it. I've got you." Her knife was small, a fold-out she'd carried since college, but the blade was sharp. She slid it between wire and flesh, cutting slow enough not to nick. The dog flinched. She stilled until his breath steadied, then finished the cut. When the wire sprang, the dog jerked free, hopped backward, and then, to her surprise, nosed her wrist like an apology before bolting. He paused once at the edge of the hollow, looking past her shoulder, ears pinned, then fled into fern shadow. Past her shoulder. Alira straightened without turning around. The pendant was cold against her chest, and every hair on her arms had lifted. The forest's attention had sharpened to a point. She could feel where it anchored, a direction like a compass pull. Slowly, she turned. At first, she saw only trees. The understory was a scrim of sword fern and vine maple, the trunks black with rain memory. A shaft of light had found its way through a break in the canopy, turning dust to gold. And there, just at the edge of that light, two eyes, amber as pitch-caught flame, watching her from a lattice of leaves. Her throat went dry. The eyes did not blink. They were steady, not the wild darting of a deer or the glassy fear of the dog. They were someone's. She didn't say, "I know you." That would have been too on the nose for a feeling that had no language, that lived behind the sternum where you store things you can't afford to break. She only held those eyes and made sure her hands were open and her shoulders weren't squared as if to challenge. Something shifted, a patience changing shape, a decision crossing some quiet line. Leaves parted without sound. A figure stepped out. Even braced for it, her body tried to step back. He was enormous, taller than the alder saplings behind him, broader than any man. Fur lay heavy over his shoulders and chest, dark as a stormed river, banded with silver like light-breaking water. The structure of his face was almost human. The planes of cheekbone and brow clear under the fur, the mouth capable of a smile or a snarl. One long, pale scar crossed the right forearm, cut clean through the fur down to skin, an old wound healed without forgetting. The air seemed to compress around him, like the woods themselves leaned closer. He didn't move nearer. He didn't need to. The distance between them was a taut wire, humming. "Thank you," Alira said softly, not certain whether she meant for the dog or for the way he had stayed at the line of the trees when every part of him could have flooded the clearing. The great head tilted. He breathed out, a sound that wasn't a word, but wasn't not one either, the exhale of someone holding language like a coal spark in their throat. Alira's pulse settled into something strange and steady, like her body had been waiting to find this tempo. She raised a hand half an inch from her side, not reaching, simply acknowledging. "I won't tell anyone I saw you." A branch snapped somewhere upridge. A voice, human, drifted faint and ugly. "Here somewhere, I swear. You see the print?" Another voice answered, too far to catch words. The first voice laughed, mean and excited. "Worth 5,000 if it's real, maybe more." The figure's eyes went flint hard at the sound. He shifted, weight rolling to the balls of his feet in a way that looked like a decision made for violence. Alira's hand rose a fraction higher without meaning to, as if a small, futile human palm could ask this whole moment to wait. "I won't help them," she said. "I never would." The amber eyes cut back to her face, searching. Another thread hummed between them. Older than this morning, older than the weeks and years she'd been gone. The scar on his arm caught a slant of light and burned white, a line like a signature on skin. The hunters moved again, closer. She heard the clink of metal against metal, the scrape of a boot on stone. The wind carried the bitter line of cigarette smoke through fern and pine. "They're setting snares," she said. "Dogs will get caught. Deer, anything." "You," her body said, but she didn't. A rumble started in his chest, not warning exactly, something like resolve. He lifted one massive hand and with 2 fingers touched his right forearm where the scar ran. Then he drew that same hand slowly upward, pressing it flat against his own chest, just beneath his throat, the place where her pendant lay against her skin. The stone leaf at Alira's neck burned suddenly warm, as if it had caught a hidden ember. She flinched, fingers curling over it instinctively. "Thank you," Alira said softly. She didn't know if it was for the dog, for his restraint, or simply for letting her see him. The amber eyes cut back to her face, searching. Another thread hummed between them. Older than this morning, older than the weeks and years she'd been gone. The scar on his arm caught a slant of light and burned white, a line like a signature on skin. The hunters moved again, closer. She heard the clink of metal against metal, the scrape of a boot on stone. The wind carried the bitter line of cigarette smoke through fern and pine. "They're setting snares," she said. "Dogs will get caught. Deer, anything." "You," her body said, but she didn't. He shifted, weight rolling to the balls of his feet in a way that looked like a decision made for violence. Then, with a final look, he stepped backward, melting into green as if the forest had opened a door behind him and he'd slipped through. His gaze held hers to the last sliver, a pledge, a warning, a question. Then he was gone, and the clearing was only trees and light and the smell of smoke riding a freshening wind. Alira stood alone, breath shallow. Her fingers closed around the leaf pendant. The stone was still warm where his eyes had been. A jay shrieked, alarm, from the ridge. The voices swore. A thin metal twang followed, then a curse that went high and pained. The forest seemed to smile with its teeth. Alira exhaled and moved. She wasn't going to the meeting tonight. She had a different kind of work to do before dark, a map to redraw in her head of where traps might lie, a list to make of people she could trust, a path to walk that would take her to the tree lines hunters never learned and the groves only the old people talked about in winter. She would not think about amber eyes or a scar she had not caused but somehow took personally. She would not think about the way a hand the size of a shovel had drawn a line between his scar and her pendant, as if binding them in secret fire. She took the river path home through shadow and brightness, past where the dog had fled, past the alder, past the county sign, with the hole through wild. At the last bend, she looked back, and though she saw nothing but trunks and ferns and the gold dust air, she felt it again, like a hand to her back, the forest paying attention. Somewhere behind that green, something large moved, silent as a held breath, keeping pace just far enough away to be kind. Morning arrived, smelling like rain that couldn't decide. Clouds dragged their bellies over the hills and left the pine needles wet but not dripping. Alira's aunt had already clattered through the kitchen by the time Alira came down. Coffee, a skillet, the radio muttering the weather, and a fisherman calling in about river levels. "Take the bucket to the pump when you're up," her aunt said without looking over. "And don't go past the orchard. Folks are set on being fools today." "Meeting last night?" Alira asked, filling her cup. Her aunt's mouth pinched. "Loud and light on sense. Men with more guns than hours of patience. Don't you go giving them anything to talk at either." She finally looked, brown eyes sharp, then softer. "I know how you are with that woods. Just not today, Lee." Alira nodded like agreement might hold. But the pendant lay warm against her skin, a small coal that didn't cool, and the kitchen window framed trees that felt closer than the glass. By the time the coffee was gone, the warmth had spread to a thin thrum along her collarbone, a heartbeat under her own. She pumped water, fed the chickens, mended the tear in her pack strap. The pendant's warmth ebbed when she paused and flared when she faced the tree line, a tide with a mind. Finally, Alira set the mended strap down and wiped her hands. "I'm taking the path to the orchard," she called. "Your boots better come back muddy and soon," her aunt answered. They did come back muddy, eventually, but not soon. The orchard ran to a ragged end where thornbush took over. Beyond that, the forest rose in layered shadow. Alira stepped through a gap in the bramble, careful of the thorns that hooked for skin, and the world changed temperature around her. Damp coolness climbed her sleeves. Leaf light stippled her forearms. The breath of the woods entered her lungs and didn't leave. Not far, she told herself. The pendant warmed like a scent. The path she took wasn't a path anyone had made. The land led, and she followed, toes remembering where rock should be under moss, fingers glancing trunks when the slope tipped. Every so often, she stopped and listened. When the woods are quiet, it means nothing or everything. Today, the quiet had shape, not absence, but attention. She angled toward the river and then away again, letting the thrum at her throat steer her. Birds kept their voices low. A squirrel scolded, then went quiet mid-syllable. Twice, she found a boot print in soft duff and stepped wide around it. When the air thinned with smoke for a breath, she crouched and waited until it passed, imagining the ash settling somewhere downhill on sleeves and hats and the brim of a man's mouth. Hunters. The pendant didn't cool. It pulled. A patch of ferns opened into a small, level tongue of ground where 2 firs had gone down years ago, and the rot left a soft platform tufted with moss. Alira stepped toward it and felt, at the same instant, the pendant flare hot and the hairs on her neck lift. She froze without knowing why. The next step would have brought her heel down on a litter of cleverly strewn leaves. Beneath the leaves, iron jaws lay open, their springs rust-brown and hungry. Her stomach dropped in a cold sheet. She eased her lifted foot back into the print she'd left and stared until the leaves blurred. The trap was wired to a sapling, so whatever it bit wouldn't get far. It would only thrash and chew at itself and wet the ground red while the woods listened. A low sound moved through the trees behind her, not close enough to touch her spine, but near enough to reach her bones. It was a growl, yes, but held tight, like a word spoken between clenched teeth. Warning. "I see it," she breathed, not turning her head. Her mouth had gone dry. "I see it." She eased backward, one small shift at a time, until her heel met root instead of metal teeth. Then she turned. Tharok stood not 15 paces away, parting the shadows like something built out of the same materials. He was broader in daylight than in yesterday's gold dust light, every line of him committed to strength, the long columns of his legs, the corded power of his arms, the breadth of his chest like a door she wasn't sure she should want to open. Wet fur lay slick in places where rain had fallen through. In others, it fluffed faintly with the draft, catching light like dark grass. His eyes were amber and alive, and they did not skip past her. They took her in and weighed her and chose not to be afraid. "Thank you," she said, and this time she knew at least part of what for. He tipped his head once. The scar along his forearm shone pale as chalk. He lifted that arm, touched the line with 2 fingers as he had the day before, then lifted his hand to his chest, pressing it just below his throat. The pendant burned against her skin again, answering. She touched it without thinking, and the warmth steadied beneath her palm like it had been waiting for her hand. "Do you—" Her voice sanded off. She swallowed and tried again, softer. "Do you remember?" The forest held its breath for her. Tharok's did not. He stepped forward 1 pace, enough to bring his face fully out from a lattice of huckleberry leaves, and made a sound that was shaped like speech but not yet willing to be it. A rumble, then a pressure at the back of the sound, and then a single syllable ground out low, careful, like a stone turned in a river. Alira. Her name broke across her skin like cold water and heat at once. She had never heard it like that. Consonants softened by a mouth not built for them, vowels carried on a chest that could shake trees. She felt absurdly like laughing and crying together. Instead, she nodded. Yes. He stilled as if the word was a tremor underfoot, and he was waiting to see if it became a quake. The forest gave back their breathing. Somewhere to the east, metal knocked metal, a gate, a latch, a man impatient with a thing that hadn't yet done what he wanted. Then a voice, muffled and crude. "This way. The prints go heavy." Alira flinched and looked toward the sound. Tharok didn't. His gaze stayed on her, but something in his body reoriented, a tension like a blade turned outward. He lifted 1 hand, palm angling toward the ground in a gesture as readable as any command. "Stay low." "I won't lead them," she whispered. "I won't." His mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile and not a snarl. He turned, moving without sound, and the ferns seemed to make space for him. He took 3 steps and then looked back. The message was clear without words. "Come." She followed, placing her boots where the earth had already accepted the press of his weight. He didn't move fast. He moved correctly, through the densest understory, around elder blowdown, across a patch of lichen-crusted rock where no mark would hold. Twice he paused and waited for her to catch up, watching her feet like a teacher with a student he trusted not to fail, but not yet to fly. They crossed a shallow draw slick with moss, balancing along a nurse log. Halfway across, the pendant flared again, and a rifle cracked somewhere behind and above, the sound split by trees into a ragged clap. A magpie flurried up and scolded. Alira stumbled. In the same breath that she lost her footing, Tharok's arm was just there, not touching, braced along the air in front of her path, an offered wall. She righted herself and stepped over the last slickness, breath shaking. "I'm all right," she said, though her knees argued. He lowered his arm. The scar slid under fur as the muscles shifted. The glance he gave her then was swift and thorough and not unkind. "Safe," he said, the word heavy and careful in his chest. Then with effort, "Go." "I'm not leaving you," Alira said, and was startled by the way truth sat so simply on her tongue. "Not like this, not to be hunted in your own home." He stared at her, and for a heartbeat the forest noise took shape. Chip of a nuthatch, a drop falling from a high fern, a boot failing to find its silent place and scuffing bark. When he spoke again, it was smaller, the syllables tucked close, but it wasn't a word of command. It was her name once more certain. Alira. Yes. She dared a step closer. Not to touch, not yet, just to be nearer than fear required. "You can lead me out a way they won't follow. I'll listen. I will." Something in him eased that wasn't visible at all until it had already happened, the set of his shoulders letting down a fraction, the line of his mouth unhooking from an old habit of readiness. He angled off the log and down into the draw, moving toward a tangle of cedar where the earth dipped dark with seep. He slipped through the gap like smoke, She crouched and slid after, bark roughing her sleeves. Inside the cedar's low bower, the world muffled. Hunter voices passed upslope, thinned by distance and by the cedar's hands cupped around them. Alira could make out individual words now, and wished she couldn't. Jaw size like that, it's worth it. Won't get away twice. Laughter too bright for the place. Tharok's breath came slow beside her. He smelled of rain and peat and something like crushed bay leaves. Alira breathed him in without meaning to, and the pendant settled against her sternum. Its heat gentled to warmth, as if proximity soothed it. She tilted her head toward him, kept her voice lower than the drip of water. I freed you once. A pause. She wondered if she'd misstepped, if the line between speaking of it and remaining in it had been too thin, and she'd put her heel on the wrong side. Then he made a low sound that wasn't words, but wasn't the absence of them either. Agreement ground into a single breath. He touched the scar, 2 fingers, and though he didn't point to her throat this time, she felt the echo rise under her pendant like a heartbeat in her palm. Why did you let me see you? She asked, eyes on the cedar bark. You could have stayed back. I would have missed the trap. She swallowed. I might not have. He shifted, bark groaning softly where his shoulder brushed it. When he answered, the word was a shape he had to drag through an old riverbed to make it flow. Trust. Heat pricked behind her eyes at the work he had done to give her that word. Then I'll earn it. The hunters' voices turned. One cursed, another hissed for quiet. A third said a name she didn't recognize and then spat. Metal clinked again. Someone resetting, someone impatient. Alira pictured iron teeth rearmed, the breath of a creature who wouldn't know to be careful, the sudden red. Her stomach clenched. Tharok looked up, head cocked toward the noise, and then motioned with his chin to the opposite side of the cedar, the direction of Rivertalk. Come, he said, softer. The word fit him a little more easily this time, as if it liked the shape of his mouth. They slid out of the bower and into a corridor of willow and alder. Tharok chose a line that kept them on old stones where footprints dissolved and across patches of salal that sprang back without complaint. When they reached the river's edge, he paused, scanning the opposite bank. The water was shallow over a braid of gravel bars, brown as tea in the pools and bright where it riffled. Alira checked behind. Nothing visible. Only the feeling of being watched from the wrong places. Tharok stepped into the water, and the current braided around his calves. He looked back and extended his hand half a span toward her, not touching, an invitation and a test both. She put her palm into the space beneath his, not touching either, and stepped where he stepped. The chill climbed her boots, then her shins. The pendant cooled with it, as if the river had spoken a word the stone understood. Midstream, he angled upstream along a gravel tongue to a bar thick with drift logs, then wove through them to where the bank rose steep and fern-draped. They climbed. At the top, he crouched and reached through a screen of salmonberry, holding it back for her. As she slipped by, the leaves skimmed her hair and caught a little. He freed the leaf with a care that made her heart stumble. They stood in a small hollow, ringed with old cedar stumps, furred green, the air dim and sweet. The noise of hunters had thinned to a rumor. Here, he said, and the word came easier now, almost gentle. He touched his chest over the scar, then the air between them, then set his palm on the earth. Home, his body said, safe, for now. Alira let her breath go all the way out, lungs finally remembering how. She looked up at him, at the solemn intelligence in his gaze, at the long patience of a life lived listening to trees. I won't betray you, she said, not a promise offered like a trinket, but a truth placed like a stone where both of them could see it. He regarded her for a long heartbeat, then dipped his head, a nod that felt older than men's nods, slower and truer. Trust, he said again, answering himself as much as her, and for the first time a hint of warmth moved under the word like light under water. A crow called twice, far and thin. The pendant at her throat cooled to a quiet ember. Somewhere, hunters cursed at empty trails. Somewhere else, a dog barked and then simply trotted away. The forest exhaled through fern and cedar, and Alira realized she'd been holding more than breath since she stepped off the orchard's edge. "Thank you," she said, her third thanks in 2 days, and the only one that didn't feel strange in her mouth. "For warning me, for leading me out." Tharok's answering sound wasn't human. It didn't have to be. It filled the hollow, low and sure, like a promise laid down on the forest floor. The hollow where Tharok had led her was quiet enough that Alira could hear the rhythm of her own blood. Her boots sank a little into the cedar duff, and the moss muted every shift of her weight. She kept still, hands loose at her sides, pendant warm against her chest. Tharok studied her for a long breath, then turned and began to move deeper into the trees. His stride was unhurried but deliberate, and Alira felt the invitation in the way he did not look back to see if she followed. He already knew she would. The forest thickened as they went. Old trunks rose like pillars, their bark scarred and furred with lichen. Shafts of late light slanted down, breaking into dust and pollen, and Alira thought she heard more than her own breath in it. Voices carried on air currents, ancient and low. She brushed her fingertips against a cedar as she passed, grounding herself, wondering if he meant for her to hear this part of his world. They came at last to a grove shaped almost like a bowl, ringed with colossal stumps, centuries old. Between them, younger cedars and firs had risen, their branches overlapping to form a high green vault. The air here felt different, heavier, resonant, as if something more than wind had filled it once and might again. Tharok stopped at the edge and touched the earth with his palm, head bowed. When he straightened, his eyes sought hers, asking silently. Alira stepped into the grove with care, and the pendant flared warm. A shiver ran her spine. "You brought me here," she whispered. "Why?" The answer came not from Tharok, but from another shadow peeling itself off the far side of the circle. Larger even than Tharok, darker, fur black as wet stone, eyes a reddish cast as though firelight lived behind them. Bone beads and teeth hung in snarled ropes around his chest. His mouth curled back, showing canines meant more for ripping than warning. "Humans don't belong in sacred ground." The words came guttural but sharp, practiced, spat in a voice that had not forgotten how to speak. Alira's throat locked. She hadn't expected one to speak so clearly, so fluently. Her gaze shot to Tharok. He had stiffened, his amber eyes narrowing. "Druvik," Tharok said, and the sound of his voice, shaped to words again, startled her. Rougher than Druvik's, but true, gravel laced with river depth. Druvik's eyes slid to her, disdain curling in their depths. "You've brought prey into our grove." He took a step closer, his size making the moss quake underfoot. "You remember what they did, the traps, the fire scars, the blood in the creeks." Alira's pulse hammered. She wanted to speak, to say she remembered a trap too, but from the other side, that she had freed, that she had never set. Her lips parted, but Tharok moved between them before the words could leave, massive frame, a barrier. "She is not prey," he said. His voice was lower now, dangerous with contained force. Druvik barked a laugh that didn't sound human or kind. "You defend her? One girl against the weight of their kind? Look at the hills. The saws cut deeper every season. They spread like rot." His gaze flicked to Alira again, and his tone sharpened. "This one will betray you. Sooner or later, they all do." "I won't," Alira said, surprising even herself. The words tumbled out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know what you think of us, but I came back because I saw what was happening. I don't want your woods destroyed. I don't want anyone hunted." Druvik's lips peeled further, his teeth flashing. Pretty words. His hand flexed at his side, claws catching light. "But words don't bind. Fear does." blood does. Tharok growled then, the sound deep enough that it made Alira's ribs buzz. Druvik answered in kind, his growl pitched higher, challenging. The grove vibrated with the sound of two forces pressing against each other, the air itself thickening like storm before lightning. Alira reached for her pendant. It was hot against her palm, almost painful. "Stop," she whispered, but it vanished under the clash of their sounds. From the rim of the grove, more eyes appeared in the gloom. Shapes shifted forward, tall, furred, massive, at least half a dozen. Some watched silently, unreadable. Others grumbled agreement with Druvik, their stares sharp with suspicion. Alira's heart climbed her throat. She was ringed, outnumbered, and for the first time the danger felt absolute. She could almost taste the decision hanging there. If one of them lunged, the rest would follow. Tharok stepped forward, planting himself in the grove's center, and the others stilled. He lifted his scarred arm high, showing it to the ring of watchers. The pale line gleamed stark against dark fur. "This mark," he said, "was made by human iron, but it did not end me. She freed me." He turned, fixing amber eyes on Alira. "She gave me back my life." The words dropped into the grove like stones into still water. Murmurs broke, rolling from one shape to the next. Alira pressed her fist over the pendant, trembling, but holding their gaze. Druvik's growl twisted into a snarl. "One act does not cleanse the rest. You gamble all of us on a fragile memory." He took another step forward, shoulders heaving. "And if your gamble fails, it will be our blood spilled first." The pendant pulsed in Alira's grip, heat flaring up her arm, and she found herself speaking before doubt could choke her. "Then test me. Watch me. If you think I'm here to betray you, don't trust me yet. But don't punish him for believing I'm not your enemy." A silence followed, heavy, fraught. Even the grove's ancient air seemed to pause. Druvik's stare seared into her, then slid to Tharok. "You protect her now. But when the fire comes, when the hunters close their jaws, we'll see if your faith holds." With that, he turned sharply and shouldered through the ring of others, his massive bulk vanishing into shadow. A few followed. The rest lingered a breath longer, unreadable, then slipped away one by one until the grove was empty save for Alira and Tharok. The silence left behind was immense. Alira's knees weakened, and she let herself sink onto a mossed stump, breath ragged. Tharok crouched in front of her, his face nearer now than it had ever been. His amber eyes searched hers, not for weakness, but for truth. "I won't betray you," she whispered again, softer now, but iron at the core. He reached out, not touching, just letting his massive hand hover near her pendant. The warmth surged in answer. His gaze softened, and he gave the smallest of nods. Above the grove, a crow called once, harsh, warning. Smoke drifted faint on the air, not campfire, but something wilder, hungrier. Alira lifted her head toward the smell, dread hardening her spine. The hunters hadn't given up. They were closing in. The first tendril of smoke came as a whisper. Alira tilted her head and caught the sting of it on her tongue, resin and gasoline, wrong together. Tharok's head snapped toward the rim of the grove, amber eyes flaring. Then the wind carried a sharper bite, and through the vault of trees a sudden orange glow flickered. "They've lit it," Alira breathed. Tharok rose to his full height, shoulders tense as cable. The pendant at her throat flared with heat, almost searing. From beyond the grove came the unmistakable crackle of flames racing through dry brush, followed by shouts, hunters riling themselves, driving prey into panic. "They'll burn everything," she whispered, throat thick. Tharok looked down at her, the set of his jaw a mixture of fury and command. He extended a hand, not touching, but urging her upward. "Come." Alira took it without hesitation. His palm dwarfed hers, warm and rough, the grip careful even in urgency. He pulled her to her feet and guided her toward the far side of the grove, where the undergrowth lay dense and dark. They had barely cleared the bowl when the fire's light leapt higher, painting the trunks in hellish strokes. The roar of it was like the surf of an ocean suddenly born in the woods. Heat pressed against Alira's skin, though the flames were still yards away. From the shadows ahead came a roar that answered the fire, guttural, furious, meant to challenge. Druvik emerged, his black-furred bulk backlit by the blaze, eyes catching the fire's reflection in feral red. Bone trophies rattled against his chest as he stepped into their path. "You led her here," Druvik thundered. His voice was sharper now, honed by the fire's fury. "Brought weakness into our heart. Now they come, and we all burn." Tharok set himself between Alira and Druvik, his shoulders braced, fur bristling. The sound that rose from his chest shook the air, not words, but a vow. Druvik lunged. The clash of them was like stone on stone. Their massive bodies slammed together, claws raking, teeth flashing. Moss tore under their feet, dirt spraying. Alira staggered back, heart punching her ribs, the heat of the fire licking at her shoulders. "Stop!" she cried, though her voice broke in the roar of combat. Tharok's scarred arm locked against Druvik's throat, pushing him back, but Druvik twisted with brutal strength, throwing Tharok into a cedar trunk hard enough to splinter bark. Tharok grunted, staggered, then drove forward again. Their blows shook the grove, each strike echoing like drumbeats in the canopy. Alira's pendant pulsed with every impact, as if the stone itself knew what hung in balance. She clutched it, torn between fear and fury. Hunters' voices drifted closer, faint at first, then louder. "There! Do you hear that?" Accompanied by the crack of breaking branches as men drove toward the sounds of beasts colliding. "No," Alira whispered. If they found the grove now, they'd kill them both, no matter who won. Tharok and Druvik locked again, muscles straining, claws digging into shoulders. Blood darkened fur, hot in the firelight. Druvik shoved, forcing Tharok onto his knees. The rival's voice growled in triumph. "She makes you weak. Human weakness. You'll die for her, and your death will kill us all." Alira's body moved before fear could stop it. She grabbed a length of fallen branch, its end still smoldering from fire that had kissed it. With a cry that startled even her own ears, she drove the flaming wood at Druvik's flank. Sparks scattered, smoke choked her lungs. Druvik roared and jerked away, the fire grazing his fur. The rock surged up in the same instant, slamming a fist into Druvik's chest. The blow sent the rival staggering backward into the blaze-lit ferns. For a breath, Druvik looked like a figure of smoke and fire, teeth bared in a snarl that promised he wasn't finished. Then he spun and vanished into the burning woods, leaving the grove trembling with silence. Alira dropped the branch, coughing, her knees weak. The pendant seared against her skin, alive, answering. She looked up through streaming eyes to find Tharok staring at her, chest heaving, fur matted with blood and sweat. "You—" Her throat rasped. She swallowed. "He would have killed you." Tharok's gaze softened, the fury draining into something else, something that caught at her breath even more than fear. He reached out, slow, and brushed his knuckles near her shoulder, not quite touching, but the heat of him bled through the space. From beyond the grove, the hunters shouted again, closer now, the glow of their torches bobbing. The fire's roar pressed like a storm tide. "They're coming," Alira said. Tharok gave a low growl, agreement, warning, and promise in one. He turned, beckoning her into the shadows of a half-collapsed cedar hollow. Together they slipped inside, just as torchlight slashed the clearing. Through the cracks, Alira saw men in hunting coats stride into the sacred ground, rifles at their shoulders. One kicked at the moss where blood pooled dark. Another crouched, touching a print in the soil with greedy fingers. "Close," one muttered. "So close." Alira's pulse raced. She pressed her hand against the warm cedar at her back, the pendant burning beneath her fingers. Beside her, Tharok's breathing slowed, deliberate, controlled, as though he was holding the forest's patience in his chest. The hunters searched, cursing when they found nothing, the firelight painting them into devils. After a time that stretched like years, they moved on, following Druvik's trail instead of theirs. Only when their voices dulled did Alira finally let herself breathe. She sagged against the cedar, trembling. Tharok turned his head, amber eyes gleaming in the dark, and met her gaze. In the silence that followed, his voice came low, gravel-worn soft. Strong. The word struck harder than any vow. Alira swallowed, unable to look away. Not without you. The pendant flared one last time, then eased into steady warmth. Outside, the fire raged. Inside the hollow, 2 heartbeats aligned. The fire waned with dawn, leaving smoke curling like ghosts through the blackened understory. The hunters had retreated, coughing and cursing, convinced their prey had slipped deeper into the mountains. In their wake, the forest was hushed, as if waiting to see what would grow from the ash. Alira emerged from the cedar hollow with Tharok at her side. His fur was scorched in places, streaked with dried blood, but his stride was unbowed. Amber eyes caught the morning light and burned steady. At the grove's edge, figures waited, the others. Some bristled at sight of her, others held still, unreadable. Druvik was not among them. His shadow lingered in the scars of fire, but his body had vanished into smoke and silence. Alira lifted her chin. Her throat was raw, her hands blistered where she had clutched the burning branch, but she did not shrink. She pressed her palm over the pendant, still warm, as if the stone wanted to speak for her. "She stood with me," Tharok said, his voice carrying through the grove. "When Druvik would have killed, she fought." Murmurs rippled through the tribe. One elder, silver fur braided with cedar bark, stepped forward. His eyes studied Alira, then the scar on Tharok's arm, then the scorched earth. "A human would burn us out," he said at last. "But this one, she burns beside you." Alira's heart thudded. She stepped closer to Tharok until his shadow mingled with hers. "I won't betray you," she said, voice steady though her pulse raced. "This is your forest, your home, but I love it too. I'll protect it with you, if you'll let me." She lifted the pendant between them, the token he had carved for her long ago, worn close to her heart through every year apart. It seared hot against her throat, not pain, but an answering fire. Tharok looked down at her, his great hand lifting slowly until it hovered near her face, as if asking without words. She leaned into it, her cheek brushing his knuckles, and his touch came gentle as rain. Gasps stirred the watching tribe. Some growled low, unsettled, but the elder nodded once, solemn. "The forest chooses, as it always has." A low wind coursed through the grove then, cool and sweet, scattering ash and bringing with it the smell of green growth waiting beneath the black. The sound moved like a blessing. Alira felt it pass over her skin and through her lungs, filling her with something vast. Tharok turned fully toward her, his amber eyes fierce and unflinching. "Mate," he said, the word thick but sure. His voice trembled with the weight of vow. Alira's throat tightened, but she lifted her hand, pressing the pendant between them so its warmth touched his scarred chest as well as her palm. "Yes," she whispered. "Yours." The forest answered. A chorus of crows wheeled above, calling sharp and wild. Wolves howled in the distance. The tribe lowered their heads, some in grudging acceptance, some in reverence. Tharok bent, his forehead touching hers, fur damp with smoke and sweat. And in that contact, something shifted. The pendant flared, the scar on his arm glowed faintly pale, and Alira felt the seam between their worlds knit closed. Human and guardian, bound. The fire would scar the land, but green would return. The hunters would come again, but she would be ready, not alone. In Tharok's eyes, she saw not just survival, but a life written into the roots of the forest itself. When they stepped from the grove, it was side by side, his hand enormous and careful enfolding hers, the forest whispering around them like it had been waiting centuries for this answer. If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.